This episode is brought to you by Hyundai. Think you know what an electric vehicle should be? Think again. From the charge time and range in the Ioniq 5 and 6 to the 601 horsepower Ioniq 5N, Hyundai is redefining what EVs should be. Learn more about Hyundai EVs at HyundaiUSA.com. EPA estimated 303-mile driving range for 2024 Ioniq 5 SE SEL limited rear-wheel drive and 361-mile driving range for 2024 Ioniq 6 SE long-range rear-wheel drive with fully charged battery. Actual range may vary.
This episode is brought to you by Paramount Plus. Gladiator 2 is now streaming on Paramount Plus. Rated R. Years after the death of Maximus, Lucius is forced into the Colosseum after his home is conquered by tyrannical twin Roman emperors. With the future of the empire at stake, he must find strength and honor to return the glory of Rome to its people. Gladiator 2, now streaming on ParamountPlus.com.
The bishop boldly declared that he held his bishopric from God and St. Cuthbert, and that he was bound to no man for it, except to the king as his temporal lord. He demanded to be judged by the canons of the church and refused to plead his case in a lay court. So writes the 12th century Anglo-Norman chronicler Orderic Vitalis. Welcome to Fortune's Wheel Podcast, a podcast that explores the infinitely fascinating and oft overlooked high and late Middle Ages. I'm your host, Jonathan, and what you can expect to hear on this show is a story of our collective Western history. Specifically on this episode, the third part of a larger tale of how three brothers dealt with the death of their legendary father. This isn't a polished story with neatly placed heroes and villains, but rather a complicated story of three young men cast haphazardly upon the peaks of European power. A massive vacuum was left when their father, William the Conqueror, King William I of England, Duke of Normandy, passed away, and his three boys were left picking up the pieces. This mini-series that I'm calling A Tale of Three Brothers is a story of sibling rivalry, betrayal, power, ambition, broken alliances, massive political restructuring, and each man's quest for legitimacy and legacy, on a channel-spanning scale that includes kingdoms, duchies, counties, and even the Holy Land itself. Now, truth be told, folks, I really thought I could take us up to the First Crusade, from the standpoint of England and Normandy, that is, in 3 episodes. But alas, history has made a liar out of me once again. The story of Robert Curthose, William Rufus, and Henry Beauclerk is one that is far more nuanced than I initially took it to be. And in light of all this new research, I'm forced to expand it beyond my initial 3 episodes. History's just full of surprises, right? So on this episode, we focus on the price of rebellion. We'll see a bishop on trial, a young count try and fail at getting his inheritance, and numerous other people whose time had come to pay up for the crimes committed, and others who earned a little something extra for the deeds performed. Before we begin, please consider joining us on Patreon, where you can enjoy more than 20 hours of bonus content as of this recording for as low as just $1 a month. We have full series covering stories such as Poland's rise through the 11th century and our current ongoing series covering the legendary Alexius Komnenos. Join our growing community and help this show bring our shared story to life. This is episode 149, entitled The Price of Rebellion. Thank you for your support. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show. When the dust had settled, King William II was able to collect and reflect upon the reports coming in from around the kingdom. The rebellion was officially over, its leaders banished from the island forever, but he realized the action may have primarily occurred in the southeast. Specifically in the earldom of Kent, the rest of the kingdom was seeing a little more action than he previously was aware of. In the west of England, things weren't so peaceful. Previously on the show, we heard of Bishop Geoffrey of Coutances and Earl Robert de Mowbray of Northumbria, his nephew. They were catching up with each other in Bristol. Well, it turns out it wasn't actually a social call de Mowbray was on. See, Geoffrey and Robert decided to ride out of Bristol and pillage and burn both Bath and Berkeley, where they were joined with William of U's forces, though Wiltshire put up a stiffer resistance and they were turned back. However, things didn't go so smoothly the next time, around the time that Rufus was pulling up on Tonbridge. It turns out that 3 noblemen from Herefordshire, Osborne Fitzrichard, Roger de Lacy, and Ralph of Mortimer, pulled in the support of an up-and-coming knight, Osborne's son-in-law, Bernard de Neufmarch, and with a combined force of English, Norman, and Welsh mercenaries, rode against Hereford, overrunning it, burning Gloucester to the ground, and smashing Worcestershire to pieces. But the self-proclaimed protector of Worcester, Bishop Wulfstan, the same bishop who had preemptively excommunicated anyone in England who supported the rebellion, had gathered a force of his own, and as the rebel army approached high on the hog of recent victories, Bishop Wulfstan ordered his own garrison to ride out to meet them. These were the days of the warring bishops. Pretty interesting stuff. Now, Frank Barlow writes in his book, William Rufus, quote, "So great a faith had they in their bishop that by a miracle they caught the enemy unawares while destroying the episcopal estates and drove them off, killing 500 knights of the infantry and capturing some of the knights." End quote. Now, at some point before the culmination of the hostilities in the West were brought to an end by Bishop Wulfstan, Bishop William of Durham rode north after hearing of the Rufus loyalist sheriff of Yorkshire, Ralph Pagnell. Now, he began grabbing all of the bishop's estates up there. Ralph Pagnell was also raiding into the bishop's farms and villages, terrorizing the people there to lose faith in their bishop. And when Bishop William arrived in Durham, instead of making a stand or something like that, well, this little brat had the audacity to whine and cry to the king and play the victim. This is the exact letter William of St. Calais, that is, Bishop William of Durham, wrote to King Rufus. Quote, "To William, King of the English, his lord, William, Bishop of Durham, sends greetings and loyal service. Know, Lord, that your men of York and Lincoln have arrested my men, seized my lands, and even tried to capture me. And they say it is on your orders that they have done all these things. I therefore require you, as my lord, to ensure that my men and lands, with their chattels, are returned to me, your loyal man, whom you have not formally charged with any crime, and who has never refused to do you justice. If indeed you do charge me later with some crime, I shall be ready to do you justice in your court at a suitable time on receipt of a safe conduct. And I earnestly beseech you to stop treating me so basely and dishonorably and depriving me unjustly of my lands on the advice of my enemies. Not all men, however, have the right to judge bishops. And I offer to you justice only in accordance with the laws of my order. And if in the meantime you would like to have the service of me and my men, I offer it to you at your pleasure." End quote. Well, here's the thing about William Rufus. See, he didn't play too nicely with the clergy. Rufus had leveled up on him, even after his death, a myriad of accusations of impropriety and scandalousness that may have evidence of truth, but they simply do not have the abundance of evidence with which to be accurate in the eyes of history. He's said to have been homosexual, but no clear evidence has surfaced, only conjecture and hatred by the overly sensitive monk chroniclers. Rufus is said to have been a tyrant, but he demonstrated many times both traits of a tyrant and a fair and competent leader. Again, the conclusions of a vengeful clergy. And he's said to have been an outright atheist, but okay, he really disdained the religious types around him with their piety and sensitivity and their boring ways of life, to be fair. But he never actually declared anything, and he still participated, so far as we can tell, in most, if not all, of the religious aspects of medieval life. But when it came to Bishop William of Durham, again, William of St. Calais, sending this rather terse letter to him demanding that the king's court would not suffice, rather, the courts of, quote-unquote, his order would be the only way to correctly judge him, well, William Rufus didn't take too kindly to that. In fact, the whole bit about not all men have the right to judge bishops was a clear jab at the king himself, stating unequivocally that Rufus was not good enough, even as a king, to pass judgment on a bishop. So, how did Rufus respond to this affront? Well, he disinherited the good Bishop of Durham, this William of St. Calais, of all his lands in Yorkshire, giving Howden to Count Odo of Champagne, the third husband of his Aunt Adelaide, by the way, and to Count Alan Rufus of Richmond, he gave Welton. These were two of Bishop William of Durham's biggest estates. Now, he offered the bishop safe conduct through Yorkshire all the way down into his court, basically telling Ralph Pagnell to back off while the bishop worked his way south. But see, by June, as the siege of Rochester was in full swing, Bishop William had given so many demands prior to showing up in Rufus's court that he had spent all of Rufus's remaining patience with these rebellious men in the kingdom. Bishop William demanded first that he be given his lands in full before he moved south. When that was rejected, the bishop demanded damages paid for the losses received. When that too was rejected, Bishop William of Durham demanded, see a pattern here, the court be conducted under canon law and not the king's law. All the while Lanfranc's confidant, Abbot Guy of St. Augustine's, negotiated with Bishop William, all while this is happening, Sheriff Ralph Pagnell never let up because Bishop William never took the king up on his offer to pass safely through Yorkshire. Now, July of 1088 came. Rochester fell in dramatic fashion, and Odo of Bayeux and his rebellious ilk were booted from the island. This allowed Rufus to face north, to face his rebellious Bishop of Durham. When one of Bishop William's messengers, a monk of Durham, delivered one more set of demands to Rufus, the king imprisoned the monk without delay and raised an army, something the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles calls a hera, which was an old Anglo-Norse word meaning a Viking army. This is from Barlow's words. Now, Bishop William pushed William Rufus a bit too far, as we can see. Roger de Pontevin, the third son of Roger of Mortimer, Earl of Shrewsbury, along with the two barons who had previously received the bishop's lands in Yorkshire, this Odo of Champagne and Alan Rufus, well, they marched their army north and took the bishop, but not without some effort. It was decided that the bishop's case would be heard in Salisbury on November 2nd, 1088.
Lowe's knows that free is just better. That's why MyLowe's Rewards is free to join. As a member, you earn points towards MyLowe's money on eligible purchases, get exclusive free gifts, and earn free shipping at Silver Key status, all on top of weekly member-only deals. Don't wait. Join MyLowe's Rewards for free today and start saving more. Lowe's, we help, you save. Loyalty program subject to terms and conditions. Details at lowes.com/terms. Subject to change.
Now, leaving the Bishop of Durham's trial for a bit, let's check in on Count Henry of the Cotentin back in Normandy. Remember, Henry, the fourth son of the Conqueror, had bought the Cotentin from his broke eldest brother, Duke Robert Curthose, in September of 1087, and he had sided, rather quietly, I should add, with Curthose during the rebellion of 1088. Now, very little is known of Henry's movements during this time, but the detail that he had officially sided with Curthose is pretty telling. It's especially telling when we hear of his decision made in July of 1088, just after the rebellion crashed and burned. Now, Henry was poised to push across the Channel alongside Curthose in the Duke's bid for England. But when Rochester fell, Curthose remained in Normandy and simply welcomed his uncles Odo and Robert of Mortain when they arrived in exile, having been disinherited of all their lands and titles in the kingdom. Now, Barlow writes, quote, "A new feature which had to be taken into consideration was that henceforth the king would ordinarily reside in England, a change which made Normandy more attractive to the wilder men. It was, therefore, a time when not only the rebels and combatants, but also those barons who held or claimed lands on both sides of the channel had to take a decision about their allegiance. If they wanted to keep their lands in England, they had to do homage to the king, end quote. Now, William Rufus, it was now clear, would remain King of England. Henry made a curious decision in July. He decided to keep his ships at port and sail them to England. Now, he made his way to his older brother's court and humbly asked William Rufus to officially grant him his lands in England, the lands he was gifted by their mother, Matilda of Flanders, in the days after he was born. But Rufus didn't really care for Henry's support of Curthose during the rebellion and decided to punish his younger brother for such an affront. William Rufus, right there in front of Henry, granted Matilda's lands in England to Robert Fitzhamo, the son of the East Anglian sheriff who had supported the king during the rebellion. William Rufus had slapped Henry in the face using their mother's gift to Henry. It was a bad moment for the brothers, and Henry, enraged but powerless, was forced to return to Normandy in shame, his tail tucked between his legs for sure. Now fast forward to November 2nd, 1088, and we are now in Salisbury, most likely in the cathedral there, but it could have also been in the castle there. The trial of Bishop William of Durham, accused of the crime of treason against the King of England, was beginning. Those in attendance seemed to be quite a large number, but only specific people are listed in the registry. Archbishop Lanfranc of Canterbury and Archbishop Thomas of York were both there. Bishop Geoffrey of Coutances, the accused uncle, remember, who was also part of that rebellion, he was there as well, but he had been given forgiveness. Roger of Montgomery, Earl of Shrewsbury, and the two barons who negotiated Bishop William's surrender in Durham, Alan Rufus and Odo of Champagne, they were also there. The nobility in attendance also included Henry of Beaumont, Roger Bigot, Ralph Pagnell, and Ranulph Peveril. Sheriffs, reeves, huntsmen, and other officials of the laity, says Barlow, as well as abbots and bishops galore, were also all in attendance. The trial of William of St. Calais, Bishop of Durham, was quite the event in November of 1088. It began by Henry of Beaumont leveling the charge against Bishop William in front of the king and all those assembled. Henry of Beaumont claimed to be an eyewitness to the treason committed. From this point, it was clear that Bishop William had done his homework. In fact, records indicate Archbishop Lanfranc compiled a vast library of secular and canon law for Bishop William and those defending him to study between the months of August and November. And it appears that they took the archbishop up on the task. Bishop William and his supporters argued that should King William refuse to honor the bishop with an ecclesiastic court, then, according to ecclesiastic law, he could appeal to the Pope and have the trial there instead. Now, to pull in our last season of the podcast, it's now 1088, and Pope Gregory VII has been dead for about 2.5 years. But see, neither the conqueror nor his successor, William Rufus, had officially recognized a new pope. So that made honoring such a request, well, complicated at best. In short, though, in the moment, King William refused to grant such a request and made clear his belief that the Bishop of Durham had offended the crown, knowing full well that no successor had been officially recognized by the kingdom. No papal successor, that is. We actually see in the records quite a bit of Rufus's personality, as we have some direct quotes from him, actually. When Bishop William began arguing what kind of court this should be, Rufus is reported as saying, quote, "I thought that the bishop was first going to reply to the charges I've made against him, and I'm amazed that he wants something else." End quote. Just a little sarcastic, we can see. But Bishop William pushed on anyway. Barlow writes, quote, "He therefore consistently refused to acknowledge the jurisdiction of the king's court as constituted, challenged the participation of the laity, declined to plead to the charge, refused to accept any of the judgments pronounced, and confined his arguments to procedural issues." End quote. Now Barlow follows it up with this, quote, This conflict of laws, when expressed so clearly and pushed so uncompromisingly, was a most unwelcome innovation, and the bishop's attitude exasperated or infuriated almost every member of the court. End quote. So William of St. Calais is making no friends at this court, it sounds like. Now, at some point during the proceedings, Bishop William asked to consult with the clergy. Rufus waved him off and said, quote, unquote, "Consult your own men. You shan't have advice from mine." But the king's men had the ace up their sleeve. Now, finally clearing it all up, they argued the following. Back in 1082, when Bishop Odo of Bayeux was brought up on charges of stealing Canterbury church lands by Archbishop Lanfranc, the precedent was set that Odo's secular power was on trial, not his ecclesiastical office. In the same vein, Bishop William of Durham was on trial for his secular decisions. His secular titles and lands were on trial, not his office as bishop. He was standing trial for, quote-unquote, in Barlow's words, breaking his fealty to the king while on a military campaign. His lands and his castle were on the chopping block, not his bishopric. Therefore, Rome had no business interfering with this trial, as it was a purely secular trial on the charge of treason, not a religious one. And it was Archbishop Lanfranc who held this same position firmly from the first word to the last during the trial. Now, Barlow calls Lanfranc, quote-unquote, a logician of the highest reputation. So Lanfranc convinced the court that there was indeed a clear distinction between the two types of court Bishop William was arguing against. Bishop William's adamant refusal to acknowledge this was, well, in my opinion, less that he didn't quite understand the distinction and more that he was fully aware of it, and that he was also fully aware that he was sunk because of it. Oh, that wasn't the ace up their sleeve, though, I should add, the king's men. Lanfranc's argument that there was a crystal clear distinction between a secular trial and an ecclesiastical trial was a grand argument to make, no doubt. But there was one piece of information to come out during the trial that buried Bishop William's entire reputation. Now, putting the pieces together with witnesses, including the king, it seems that William of St. Calais was playing both sides of this rebellion. He was a confidant of the king, if you remember. He then met with his uncle, Bishop Geoffrey of Coutances, in Bristol. He then rode to the king and unloaded all he knew about the rebellion already. He rode back to his uncle in Bristol and left for Yorkshire just before the blow-up in the west, when he heard word of Ralph Pagnell ravaging his lands. See, William of St. Calais was a bit of a double agent. So not only did he anger the rebels in attendance, those who had been granted peace by the king after the rebellion, as well as those back in Normandy where they would eventually hear word of this trial, but he also royally pissed off his king. It took just one day, November 2nd, 1088, to run through the entire trial of William of St. Calais, Bishop of Durham, for the charge of treason against King William II of England. By the end of the afternoon, Henry of Beaumont, the man who opened the trial with the charge itself, closed the trial with the verdict. And here it is. Bishop William lost his castle, and thus his entire fief in Yorkshire. And when Bishop William verbally refused to accept the verdict, Henry of Beaumont declared that Bishop William had thus violated the terms of the negotiation with Odo of Champagne and Alan Rufus 2 months earlier, and was thus stripped of his promise of safe conduct. Yeah, that means that Bishop William just opened himself up for immediate imprisonment, not as a bishop, but as a vassal of the king. Again, Lanfranc's distinction. King William appealed to his noblemen assembled to pressure the bishop into accepting the court's ruling and admitting that it was just a decision properly conducted. But folks like Roger of Montgomery quietly responded to the king not to put them in such a position. It was as if Rufus was pleading without actually pleading for the bishop to just accept it all already, so they can just move on with their lives without much of a stir. And that William Rufus, King William II of England, wouldn't be the king to imprison a bishop. That was big. But Bishop William still refused the ruling and insisted on appealing to Rome. This guy. Now, William Rufus began to lose his temper a bit as the day dragged on, and when Bishop William refused to give up his castle, Rufus said to him, quote, "As you won't accept the judgment of my court, you must now surrender your castle." End quote. Now, later, becoming even more exasperated with his old friend, the king says, quote, "By the face of Lucca, you'll never escape from my hands before I have that castle." End quote. And then, quote, "Believe me, Bishop, you're not going back to Durham, and your men aren't going to stay at Durham, and you're not going free unless you release the castle." End quote. And finally, we have Rufus almost yelling this, quote, "You're getting no safe conduct, and you'll stay at Wilton until I know that the castle is in my power, and then you can have ships and a safe conduct." End quote. The ships meaning, "I'm done with you, get out of my kingdom." Now, it seems that Bishop William had pushed his king too far. Barlow writes, quote, "By betraying the conspirators and then deserting the king, he had offended all. By refusing to submit and throw himself on the king's mercy, he outraged the conventional. And by grudgingly admitting defeat while still defying the king, he made his position as bad as possible. He would know that once he had been condemned and lost his safe conduct, other enemies would attack, and his main concern became to get out of England as quickly as he could." End quote. The bishop sailed from Southampton in utter shame, but, as Rufus declared in court, he was in fact held at Wilton, until word came that the royal garrison had successfully taken Bishop William's castle up north. Word came on November 14th that the castle was given to Ivo Talibois and Ernest de Biron. By November 21st, William of St. Calais sailed from England forever. And as it turned out, was welcomed by Robert Curthose so warmly, quote unquote, that he decided to stay on as one of his advisors, according to Barlow. The rebellion itself had been suppressed, and England had a little healing to do once again, especially with the departure of William of St. Calais. By Christmas of 1088, there seemed to be a shift in the kingdom toward the positive, all things considered anyway. As we asked on the last episode, was this a sign of Edward's green tree prophecy coming to life? Was God intervening in the healing and the coming together in England after the English gave their almost full unanimous support to their Norman king? I don't know. But King William II still needed to make a statement. He needed to ensure that this sort of thing never happened again. With the likes of Odo of Bayeux, Robert of Mortain, Robert of Bellême, and now William of St. Calais out of the kingdom, Rufus could begin to divvy out various other punishments that fell short of complete exile. But William had a balancing act to perform at this point, a rather precarious one. Who should be punished and who should walk free? Or who should be punished and then forgiven? I don't know. Now, as Barlow writes, quote, "It was necessary in order to instill fear that some should be severely punished, and the king's fanaticism in matters of honor and great sense of dignity ensured that this would be done," end quote. But as much as William Rufus wanted to make examples, and as Barlow puts it, quote unquote, examples should be made, cooler heads did prevail, and Rufus slipped into his characteristic magnanimity, recognizing the older rebels as men who had served his father well, and therefore should be given a second chance. These are men like his uncle, Robert of Mortain, his friend and confidant, Roger Bigod, who chose the rebellion over his king, the Grandmanils, who chose duchy over kingdom, but whose support and wealth William I and William II needed to maintain peace, and Roger of Montgomery, Earl of Shrewsbury, who couldn't quite choose between his rebellious sons and his king, but chose to just stay out of it altogether until he couldn't at Rochester any longer, which still broke the bonds of feudal obligations, that staying out of it, his feudal obligations to Rufus. Now, in feudalism, there was no sitting the fence. You're either in or you're out. It seems that in the case of England's wealthiest and most powerful baron, Roger of Montgomery, Rufus couldn't spare him, couldn't afford to boot the guy or throw him in a dungeon somewhere. And after hearing about what Earl Roger did out in Wales, out west, well, Rufus certainly realized that Earl Roger was going to be a key component in his reign to rule over a peaceful and united kingdom. If anything, got to keep the Welsh back. So, these men, Roger of Montgomery and Roger Bigod and those, they were safe. There's also an important distinction to make that was abundantly clear back in the 11th century, but not so much today. Again, according to feudal obligations, should you take up arms for your liege lord, you did absolutely nothing dishonorable or illegal. This was important because this key piece was at the heart of how Rufus dealt with these rebels. Sure, Odo of Bayeux could be seen as Rufus's vassal because Odo was Earl of Kent in England, and merely a bishop, albeit a pretty powerful one, back in Normandy. Earl Odo, that is Earl Odo, rebelled against his king. Illegal and dishonorable, without question. He deserved all the punishment meted out to him, if not more. However, those who served under Odo, as in Odo was their liege lord, well, they were merely meeting their feudal obligations. And how could William Rufus, a man who was quite zealous in his attitudes toward proper feudalism, how could he possibly punish these men for stepping up to the plate and meeting these obligations to their liege lord? This right here is why the likes of Uncle Robert of Mortain, who held the castle and area of Pevensey under Bishop Odo, as well as the Grandmanils, who also held lands in Kent, this right here is why they were spared of any serious retribution, even given a bit of forgiveness. Though the ideas of chivalry wouldn't come to full fruition for another century or so, they were, without question, being handled and molded and kneaded and worked with during this time. And William Rufus was a key player at the topmost rungs of European elitism, who was ushering in this new, polished structure of knighthood and feudalism. Now, shifting to others. Rufus had a distinction to make about Eustace III of Boulogne, son of old Eustache, friend of Edward the Confessor. Now, he also had the ruthless Robert of Bellême to deal with, who, man, he had quite the mean streak in him, as it's said. For Game of Thrones fans, I can't help but liken him to Ramsay Bolton. Yeah, the guy who flayed alive his prisoners for entertainment purposes only, or fed women and children and the elderly to his ravenous dogs and watched it all happen, wearing a twisted smile. Well, more on Robert of Bellême in a bit. But as for Eustace III of Boulogne, he was readily exiled from the kingdom. He would be the last nobleman from Boulogne to even think of visiting England for quite some time, thus cutting off the English from these future crusaders' wealth and prestige, hint, hint. Now, as for Robert of Bellême, which we will actually get into more detail on the next episode, Orderic Vitalis has said that this Norman baron was pretty creative in his cruelty, inventing quote-unquote new and hitherto unknown tortures, which included hanging men upside down from their, come on, don't make me say it. So, his two main fortresses, Chateau de Bellême and Chateau de Domfront, were said to, during his lifetime, be veritable houses of horror, albeit with an incredibly prestigious facade for his guests. Now, as I said, he gave some serious Ramsay Bolton vibes. Now, William Rufus banished Robert of Bellême from England, but spoiler alert, this won't last. But again, let's not get too ahead of ourselves. Suffice it to say that the likes of Robert Bellême were insanely difficult to control, let alone depose from power. He was far too wealthy, far too influential, and maybe more importantly, far too feared. But in 1088, he was far too dangerous to keep in the kingdom, so out he went. But, as Barlow writes, quote unquote, for those who went down, others came up. There were some who were granted royal forgiveness, such as, again, Roger Bigod, as Bishop Geoffrey of Coutances, Gilbert Fitzrichard of Tonbridge, the man who opposed him at Tonbridge for a couple days, and the Grandmills. But those who sided with the king from the outset were to rise through the nobility quite rapidly under William Rufus. One of the biggest winners was Roger Fitzhamo, the son of the Sheriff of Kent. We mentioned him earlier. Now, Robert Fitzhamo, if you remember, was given Queen Matilda's lands, which were actually supposed to go to Henry, as well as the city of Gloucester. To boot, he was given the hand of the powerful Earl of Roger of Montgomery's daughter as well, which catapulted the son of a sheriff to high prominence seemingly overnight. In addition to Fitzhamo's windfall, William of Warenne's son, also confusingly called William de Warenne, succeeded the deceased earl's title as the second Earl of Surrey, thus solidifying this line, the line of the Warenne family, Earls of Surrey, for generations to come. And this family would actually play an increasingly important role in high and late medieval history. By 1089, Henry of Beaumont was the first Earl of Warwickshire. The son of the long-deceased Earl Waltheof was given the title of Earl of Huntingdon and Northampton in that same year. And by 1090, because of his continued loyalty to Rufus, beginning in the Rebellion of 1088, Walter Giffard was given the title of First Earl of Buckingham. Now back to 1088, though. Rufus was also able to stop for half a minute and make some ecclesiastical appointments, a very not Gregorian thing to do, remember. Now, it's worth keeping in mind William Rufus's very anti-clerical sentiments. Some may call them blasphemous or even anti-Christian. So when he makes these appointments, one must consider how much thought he put into them. But with Lanfranc also at the helm and the influence of the powerful Bishop Thomas of York, there was some consideration for the best of what's best for the church itself. First up was the Church of Chichester, which had been empty of leadership since the death of the shamed Archbishop Stigand years earlier. Rufus appointed someone who simply died within the year, so there would be no real rush to fill it back in. John of Tours, William the Conqueror's personal physician, took the reins of the church at Wells in July of 1088, almost immediately after the rebellion ended. A man named Herbert Losinga left his title of prior of the legendary Fécamp Abbey to assume the abbacy of Ramsey. So plenty of people were rising through the ranks under William Rufus. With the chaos and turmoil and tumult of 1088 came a relatively light and peaceful 1089 in England under King William II. The year 1089 would still serve a very important purpose in the ongoing saga of Robert Curthose, William Rufus, and Henry Beauclerk, but it was as if all those involved seemed to stay in their respective corners for the time. Curthose had tried and failed to aid a rebellion that would have seen him wearing the crown. Rufus had squashed a dangerous rebellion and earned the respect of his kingdom. And Henry tried and failed to retrieve his mother's lands promised to him, but he succeeded in securing the county of Cotentin for his own, and began the collection of taxes with which to bolster his coffers. However, back in England, Rufus would receive both a curse and a blessing on May 28th of 1089. Now that day saw the death of one Archbishop Lanfranc of Canterbury, Rufus's longtime mentor and one-time tutor. Barlow writes of Lanfranc the following, quote, "He had been the most distinguished incumbent of the See of Canterbury since St. Dunstan in the 10th century. A monk of unsullied reputation, a renowned master of the arts, a theologian of some note, and a renovator of Canterbury's claim to be the quote-unquote the mother church of England, Scotland, and Ireland, and the neighboring isles. Primate of the whole of Britain." End quote. Prior Godfrey of Winchester wrote the following dedication to Lanfranc, quote, "Dwelling on earth, your mind sought out the heavens. Released from earth, you fly up to the stars. End quote. Now, Lanfranc had been instrumental in William Rufus's rise to the throne of England. His organizing of the kingdom initially, his overcoming of a major threat to his rule, and his reorganizing of the kingdom after that threat was squashed. Without Lanfranc, one might make the argument that Rufus's reign may not have begun as smoothly as it did, rebellion and all. But now Lanfranc was gone, and William Rufus was free. And as we know, freedom is both a blessing and a curse. Things were, however, by and large, on the up and up. William Rufus no longer had the short leash of a man of reason around his neck, but he also didn't have the threats that required that leash to be yanked from time to time. And this relative peace during 1089 to 1090 allowed Rufus to begin to relax a bit. Money began pouring into the royal coffers as well. The money he received from abbeys and bishoprics in these 2 years was impressive. In 1089, he received roughly 1,200 pounds sterling. By 1090, Rufus received 2,200 pounds sterling. This was a massive jump. A jump that can only take place through peace. The mid-1090s would see a dip in this income from ecclesiastical offices, but by the end of the decade, by the end of the century, English churches would be a major form of revenue for the crown. This is largely due to what happened in the wake of Lanfranc's death in late May 1089. William Rufus, again, not much of a church fellow himself, would leave the Archbishopric of Canterbury vacant. I repeat, vacant. What this did was allow the king, not the church, to collect all revenue from Canterbury's lands, whereas before, the king would only get a nice cut. This is a major reason that chroniclers really disliked this king. This king did nothing to really help the church out. And when your letter writers are all churchmen, well, they won't have much to say that's very positive. This is where the rumors of Rufus's sexual orientation, his lax social values, and his ungodliness really stems from. Now, is it true that he made jokes at the expense of clerics around him? Yes. Is it true that he went out of his way to upset the feelings of those same churchmen? Of course. And is it true that he never married and preferred the company of his men? Yes, also true. And is it true that the fashion of his court dipped into men wearing traditionally more feminine shoes, pants, and hairstyles? Yes, that's absolutely true as well. But are these evidence of deviant behaviors borderlining the sins outlined by his historians? Well, yes and no. We don't know if William Rufus was homosexual, but there's evidence to suggest that he was and he wasn't. We don't know if he was an atheist or agnostic, but there's evidence to suggest that he was and he wasn't. Do these things really matter in the grand scheme of history? Not really, in my opinion, but I will admit that in terms of storytelling, this is crucial character development the audience needs to understand in order to understand who William Rufus really was. But unfortunately, he remains a mystery, which is one reason I find him such an interesting character to study. But again, with Lanfranc now out of the picture, England wasn't quite sure what was in store for it. But for the time being, things were stable and secure and peaceful. The markets in Kent began opening up again, while the markets outside of Kent continued to burst with activity. But this wouldn't last long, for the nobility in England were merely resting for what Rufus had planned next.
This episode is brought to you by Paramount Plus. Gladiator 2 is now streaming on Paramount Plus. Rated R. Years after the death of Maximus, Lucius is forced into the Colosseum after his home is conquered by tyrannical twin Roman emperors. With the future of the empire at stake, he must find strength and honor to return the glory of Rome to its people. Gladiator 2, now streaming on ParamountPlus.com.
Shifting our focus to Normandy, we see a different picture altogether. English barons returning to their lands in Normandy in exile were upsetting the tenuous balance Robert Curthose had forged over the last 2 years. The likes of Robert of Bellême and Odo of Bayeux came back with quite a chip on their shoulders, and Curthose just didn't have the force of personality that his father had to control such men. The Duke couldn't even count on his little brother Henry, Count of Cotentin, to help out either. As Barlow writes, quote, "As for Henry, he was still a cub whose erratic behavior his brothers tolerated a little impatiently until it became too much to bear, and then they smacked him down." End quote. And speaking of Henry, something curious appears in Orderic Vitalis' records of the rebellion of 1088. I haven't found it elsewhere, so I'm not sure how much value I put into this, but we do know something for sure. What we don't know is whether Henry was a part of the rebellion directly under his uncle Odo. As a powerful baron controlling almost 1/3 of Normandy itself, we can assume he was at least tangentially supportive of the overthrow of Rufus in England. But as for leading men across the Channel, well, we don't know it for sure. I know I mentioned earlier that he had ships poised and ready. This is true. But for what purpose, we're not sure. We know eventually he ends up using them to go ask Rufus for help. Was this Henry kind of playing both sides? But Orderic tells us that Henry returned with Robert of Bellême after the rebellion. Well, if he returned, then that would imply that he was in England in the first place, in England during the rebellion. No English sources that I'm aware of report this, but Orderic Vitalis writing decades later, says he returned with Robert of Bellême. So what gives? What's more interesting is that other stories say that Odo imprisoned Henry and Robert of Bellême when they reached Norman shores. So why was Henry imprisoned? Was Henry part of the rebellion? And if so, why was Henry not mentioned in the records to have participated in the rebellion against William Rufus? Honestly, I wish I could shed more light on this. This is the piece of this episode that has hung it all up in the recording phase, as I've been searching everywhere for an answer, and I haven't found one that I can tie into the records. It's just Orderic Vitalis. So let's stick with what we know, I suppose. Henry returned from England with Robert of Bellême in 1088, and they were both immediately thrown in prison by Bishop Odo of Bayeux. But why? Orderic tells us that Robert Curthose believed they were sent as infiltrators to the duchy, as double agents in a sense, that they were exiled in order to convince Norman barons back in the duchy of the ineffectiveness of Curthose's rule. Robert of Bellême was released almost immediately, as, who in their right mind would want to cross Ramsay Bolton anyway? Henry, however, didn't receive such a gift. Curthose ordered him to remain in Odo's custody, some of which he spent inside one of those not-so-cozy dungeons, for another 6 months. Now, I do want to remind ourselves that we have record of Henry heading to England to ask for his mother's lands, but again, that was after, according to the records, that was after the rebellion had ended. Did he just come back with Robert Bellême at that time? It's all just, this is what you get when you're reading medieval, records. You got to kind of put it together and make do with what you have. Now, however, while Henry was in Odo's custody, Curthose needed something to galvanize and unify the duchy. And to his south, in Le Mans, there was a bit of a rebellion being whipped up there. Le Mans is the political center of the County of Maine, and remember, Duke Robert of Normandy was also the Count of Maine, due to his father's conquest some 15 years earlier. Maine, in response to their most powerful nobleman, Robert of Bellême's imprisonment, decided to thumb their nose up at the duchy. In order to march on Le Mans and put down the little rebellion, he called together all of his barons, including those who just came back from England. And in August and September of 1088, Curthose led an expedition south. Curthose was at the helm of Normandy's most dangerous men, mind you, which is always a precarious place to be. Of course, Robert of Bellême was in a prison at the moment, but others were there. Count William of Breteul was one of Curthose's oldest friends and son of the great William Fitzosborne. William of Breteul was quite connected beyond this, as he was also a great-grandson of Duke Richard I of Normandy, making him kinsman to both Bishop Odo and Robert of Mortain, let alone the conqueror himself, William Bertoul accompanied his cousin Robert Curthose on his many misadventures as well, but he also pulled in other Norman barons into this expedition. In addition, William of Evreux and Ralph de Tosney, half-brothers through their mother, also joined Curthose. Now, you'll remember the name Tosney from many, many episodes ago when we discussed the Moor Eater. Ralph de Tosney wreaked havoc and created a bit of a boogeyman tale in Muslim communities in Iberia that still sent chills down the backs of Muslims fighting against El Cid in the 1080s and 1090s. Well, his son, Ralph II de Tosney, fought alongside the Conqueror at Hastings. And now Ralph II served the Conqueror's son in his march against Le Mans. With Odo of Bayeux, these were the leading men marching into Maine in late summer of 1088. Some of the duchy's greatest veterans were working together in the name of their duke. It was exactly what Robert Curthose needed in that moment, while his little brother was enjoying a bit of peace across the channel after the failed rebellion. And with this, Le Mans fell without a sword swung. Curthose marched through the streets of Le Mans and met with his rebellious barons in peace. All the county's barons were present, whether they supported the rebellion or not, or just sat the fence. But again, in feudalism, you couldn't really do that, so pretty much everybody was represented. Duke Robert required fealty to be sworn to him, and the likes of Geoffrey of Mayenne, Robert of Crown and Sable, and Helias of La Flèche all dutifully did so. The fortress of Bayonne still held out, as did Robert of Belem's most powerful castles of Belem, Alençon, and Saint Canary. As for them, the Norman army merely approached Bayonne, and it fell. Robert chose to be merciful with them. However, Saint Canary would suffer a different fate. In an effort to not only put down the rebellion, but also to send a message to the sadistic and dangerous Robert of Belem, Curthose did something quite out of character. He did something a bit nuanced. In a show of mercy and peace, he sent for the official release and forgiveness of Robert of Belem, while simultaneously accepting the surrender of the garrison at Saint Canary, and subsequently blinding their leader and mutilating all their soldiers. Now at this point, Curthose could have certainly marched on the remaining rebels of Alençon and Belem, but he thought better of it. He made peace with Roger of Montgomery, though still loyal to the King of England as Earl of Shrewsbury, even though he was still one of the more prominent Norman barons with lands in the Montgomery region near Maine. But by extension, this also established peace with Roger of Montgomery's son, again, Robert of Belem. But after all this, Robert Curthose wouldn't enjoy this newfound peace and respectable standing as Duke for very long. After welcoming the recently exiled William of St. Calais, former Bishop of Durham, after his one-day trial back in England, 1089 would bring nothing but a disastrous collapse in Normandy, and it centered once again down in the county of Maine. The Manceaux, as the people of Maine are called, simply were not happy with the direction that their duke was taking them. Well, that and the rumors of William Rufus pouring money and influence and promises into the duchy to upset the apple cart flooded the records of the time, and historians ever since seem to believe these records. Well, the first thing Curthose tried to do was use a little, shall we call it, marital diplomacy, when he pushed for the marriage between neighboring Anjou and a powerful Manceaux baron's daughter. This was agreed upon. Count Fulk of Anjou was betrothed to Bertrada and finally married on April 24th, 1090. But during 1089, this was enough to keep things quiet in southern Normandy. However, northern Normandy, what's called Upper Normandy, was a different story. In the interest of clarity and time, let's just run through some of the mini campaigns in bullet point style that just never ceased to pop up for Robert Curthose to deal with. The first one. Count Geoffrey II of Mortagne and Perche rode against Robert of Belem over some disputed territory in northeast Normandy. Robert Curthose gifted Gilbert l'Aigle the castle of Exmes, which was Belem's, mind you, which caused Belem to attack Exmes in early 1090. ambushing and killing Gilbert Лагel in the process. This prompted Geoffrey of Mortain to offer his daughter's hand in marriage to Gilbert's son of the same name, thus allying the two families against Robert of Bellême. When two barons began allying themselves against a powerful baron within your duchy, that's not necessarily a trend you want to see forming. This occurred again in 1089 and into 1090. The next point. In 1089, in the northern frontier region called the Evresine, the castellan of Ivry-la-Bataille, owned by Curthos's good friend William of Bertoul, simply offered it to Curthos. Curthos, of course, accepted it, which forced William of Bertoul to have to buy it back, and then ride against his former vassal, the castellan who gave it away. This involved the aforementioned Bertrada, betrothed to the wife of Count Fulk of Anjou, because it was her brother, Amari III of Montfort, who was killed in the campaign. There was another claimant to that castle in Ivry-la-Bataille as well, in Count Robert of Moulins. But Robert of Moulins was in England at the time. In fact, he was in the good graces of King William II, thus further connecting England to the turmoil in Normandy between these 2 years, when Robert of Moulins appeared in Normandy to challenge that castle. I'll be honest with you and just say that somehow the city of Brionne got thrown into the mix, and in the end, Curthos gave Brionne to Robert of Moulins instead of the original castle he intended to take. Brionne was a much better grab for Robert of Moulins, but Brionne contained Bec Abbey, one of the most prominent abbeys in the entirety of Christendom. Across the entire continent, everyone knew Bec Abbey. And who is the abbot of Bec? One Anselm. And we will find Anselm coming up pretty soon in our story here. Now, Robert of Moulins, in Barlow's words, quote, tried to enforce his lordship over Abbot Anselm and the monastery, but the abbot skillfully resisted and the monks indignantly, and in the end the duke, angered by this attempted usurpation, took Brionne back, end quote. The insertion of Robert of Moulins is simply another piece of evidence that William Rufus could very well have been at work, subverting Curthos's peace in the duchy. It also introduces us to a particularly important figure, again, not only in English history, but also in Christian philosophy. Again, one Abbot Anselm of Bec. Also during 1089 to 1090 was the dispute between two wives, sisters-in-law, in fact. See, the wife of Ralph II de Tosny married Isabel, daughter of Simon the Elder of Montfort, who was described as, quote, generous, high-spirited, and playful, end quote, as well as, quote, popular withal, end quote. These were Barlow's words. A veritable Dolly Madison, you could say. While the other wife, Helwise, wife of Ralph's half-brother, William of Evreux, was, quote-unquote, shrewd, cruel, and mean. Now, Barlow also states that, quote, they both ruled their husbands and oppressed their vassals, but were also both beautiful, talkative, and lively, end quote. So basically, Orderic Vitalis tells us that Isabel must have said something about Helwise, because before anyone knew it, Conche was under attack. Remember, Ralph de Tosny ruled both Tosny and Conche was unable to resist, and it took a beating. When Ralph reached out to Curthos for assistance, Curthos flat out refused, as he was dealing with that whole Robert of Moulins affair up north at the time. Where could Ralph de Tosny turn? Well, if this went on much longer, Helwise, as she herself rode into battle dressed as a knight, by the way, would take Conche from him. Ralph de Tosny turned to none other than King William II in England. Rufus didn't pass up the opportunity and sent reinforcements to Conche immediately, earning a new friend in Tosny. Now, the other thing that happened, by the end of 1089, we see Robert Curthos in the north with King Philip of France. That's right, bringing back an old alliance with the French monarchy. Robert Curthos rode against La Ferte-en-Bray, a castle owned by Gerard of Gournay. After securing the castle, Curthos gifted, quote-unquote, the strategic manor of Gisors on the Epte, in thanks to the king. But the problem was, was that Gisors was owned by the Archbishop of Rouen. Well, this made enemies of not only Gerard of Gournay, but also the Archbishop of Rouen and the Count of Eu, who had thus far stayed out of both the rebellion against William Rufus, as well as the issues across Normandy. Why Count Robert of Eu? Well, it seems La Fertembre was inside of his county. Now, by October 1090, things in Normandy were at, as you can see, a boiling point. Curthose was barely able to keep control of his nobility. But it wasn't only his nobility he was dealing with by this time. See, Normandy had prospered off the conqueror's conquest of England. Like, it really, really prospered. And that's saying something because Normandy was already a very wealthy and prosperous and powerful and influential and all the things kind of place. Albeit a bit of a battleground for all of its barons, but that was kind of the Norman way. As big as the Norman ego was, its economy might have been the only thing bigger. And men like those in its major cities were prospering far more than the nobility were comfortable with. Case in point, there was a merchant in Rouen who had risen to become the richest non-nobleman in all of France. And if the elites in society, even today, hate anything, they truly hate new money. Conan Pilatus was this man's name, and he was richer even than some Norman barons. In fact, Conan had his own small army of mercenaries at his disposal. Yeah, this merchant had an army, and he was beginning to feel the crunch under Robert Curthose's rule. Conan and his father before him were comfortable and subdued under William the Conqueror's rule. But Curthose had allowed too much to go unnoticed and unpunished over the last few years. And Conan would like to tell the Duke about it. And we'll see what Conan had to say on the next episode. And I can't wait to tell you about it.
This episode is brought to you by Paramount Plus. Gladiator 2 is now streaming on Paramount Plus. Rated R. Years after the death of Maximus, Lucius is forced into the Colosseum after his home is conquered by tyrannical twin Roman emperors. With the future of the empire at stake, he must find strength and honor to return the glory of Rome to its people. Gladiator 2, now streaming on ParamountPlus.com.